Future Hacker. Life. Path. Future.
Welcome back, everybody. This is the third episode with Peter Cabral for Future Hacker. Peter, we have a whole new subject to cover today, which is space governance. Which are the current rules under the Space Treaty, and what are the points of concern moving forward? That's a very general question, so try to focus on whatever you think is going to be interesting for the audience.
Awesome. It is a broad question, but that's interesting because the agreement was also rather broad, but vague, right? So I'll take you back to 1967, which is when the former Soviet Union and the United States signed the Outer Space Treaty. We're in the middle of the Cold War, right? So the main concern was, obviously, the United States have a true concern in protecting their space assets, their satellites. We were at the very early stage of what could potentially be a Star War, with regards to nuclear weaponization of space. So that was a true concern. And I'm sure that for folks that lived throughout the Reagan years, there was something that was rather present, everyday's news, And obviously, USSR, that was their concern as well. They saw space as the next frontier. So both countries wanted to guarantee their domain past the globe and saw that whatever they could do out in space in terms of an expression could indeed be the extension of their projection. The agreement was very simple. Space was not there for the taking, right? So the agreement was very clear that no one could own anything, right? So let's just say that, the moon could, as a celestial body, could not belong to a country, to a sovereign country. Weaponization was forbidden, right? So when we talk about deploying nukes on space, that was completely forbidden. And there were chapters and chapters and chapters written purposefully around that. So we had two main concerns: a country, a nation owning something on space. And on the other end, we were afraid of space assets, such as satellites and spaceships and so forth. And we were worried about weaponization of space, deploying nukes, nuclear weapons up on space, and further escalate the tension that folks were living down here on Earth back in the 60s and the 70s during the Cold War days. So essentially, this sums up the agreement. So now if you think about it, decades later, we still have the very same agreement. The only difference is that there's no such thing as the Soviet Union anymore, right? So now we have republics that prospered after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. One of them is Russia. And now we have over 180 countries that signed to that particular agreement, but with no addendums. So there's a lot of stuff that's unwritten, that's undecided, that just wasn't pertinent back in the day, back in the 60s or the 70s, that today obviously gains a certain importance. And why is it important? Well, because if you think about it, if you're following the news, and yesterday Perseverance just landed on Mars, so that was a great achievement. Who's manning these space missions today? Mostly the private sector, right? So going back to late 2000s, 2008, 2006, 7, something like that, when we started to see some of the big tech coming up, when you started to see some of the involvement with whether there was Virgin Galactic or later on we had SpaceX and we also had Origin, Jeff Bezos' Amazon company, developing and researching on assisting nations or deploying space programs. So when we started to see this movement and we started to see the public sector manning their missions through the private sector, when you start to see companies focusing on these assets, you have to think about, hold on a second, so something that was written, the rules that were written for space were written and signed on 1967. The world changed. You have 180 so countries that still signed that treaty. The treaty still holds. And now you have, instead of the public sector, you have private companies going to space and launching their missions. And you have folks, people such as Elon Musk saying that he'll colonize Mars, right? And you have Richard Branson saying they'll take people up to Mars. And you have Jeff Bezos doing the same thing. So when you start to raise this awareness with regards to public and private sector, only then you realize that there's such a thing that we should be worried about, which is governance in space. Why? Because there are no rules. So this is the next frontier. And when the private sector is involved, we all know that the tendency is to take or to defend their own private interests, financial gain, and so forth. So this could be the early stages of the Wild Wild West. We could go back to the Hammurabi Code.
Yeah, so let's talk about that. So talk about the private industry taking interest about the quest to space, right? So as you mentioned, you have Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, Larry Page, Richard Branson. So this is getting crazy, right? Do you think that Virgin's galactic goal of flying space shuttles with tourists in a 2-year time frame is something feasible? Like, are we prepared for such a step? So, I know we're still discussing all the regulations that must come into place, but let's go back to us mortals actually doing tourism in 2 years to space.
Well, there's always some speculation associated with that, But think about it, Maria. I mean, these are moonshots, right? So if you think about the trajectory that these companies underwent, it's truly phenomenal. I mean, they've done so much in such little time. So I'll tell you, do not undermine these guys' potentials. So these guys are constantly aiming for the moon, and they've done phenomenal things, and they continue to do great. Whether we'll be a spacefaring nation at the late stages of this decade or not, I'll tell you that inevitably so. And there are some logistical constraints, and there are some things that, when I talk about logistically, I'm not talking about the 300 million miles that separate Earth from Mars. I'm talking about alignment. I'm talking about the actual orbit and trajectory of these bodies around the sun. So there are certain windows of time that are more interesting to procure these deployments or to deploy these deployments, because they impact distance and they impact trajectory and they impact fuel consumption and so forth. And these windows of time, these windows are approximately 2, 3, 4 years apart. So, you have to plan according to those particular time windows. But let's just say that whether by the end of this decade we'll have a manned mission on Mars, if that's possible or not, I'll tell you, yes, it is possible. I truly believe that it is possible. If we don't accomplish it by the end of this decade, we'll have, very shortly so, at the early stages of the following decade, we'll have a man-made mission. Who's going to do it? Who's going to do it first, whether it's Branson's Virgin Galactic or whether it's SpaceX, Elon Musk's, I don't know. I'm not so much focused on that. But I think that there's a great deal of intellectual power associated with that particular effort. There's a great deal of funds being allocated. There are folks involved and interested in participating in that particular type of program. And I think that with Perseverance's mission, Mars became hot again, became a hot topic. It's a sexy topic. I mean, just look at all the missions that we've had deployed to Mars last year. Recently, we had the United Arab Emirates satellite getting into Martian orbit. India just announced a Mars mission in the near future. There's a great deal of work that's being done on the science realm of things that I think will motivate that. Let's just say that in the next couple of months, we understand that, because Curiosity, the rover that was deployed in 1997, he already told us that there were true traces of water in Mars, right? That's something that we already know. Curiosity proved that. So now Perseverance landed exactly on a delta in a Jezero crater, which was a former river delta or riverbed. So if we can detect microbiotic traces of life, I'm not talking about life, I'm talking about traces of former life. If we can detect the former existence of complex organisms, or let's just say that if we can generate, because this is actually one of the rover's missions as well, let's just say that if we can transform CO2 into oxygen, just look at all the things that we've proven. Let's just say that Ingenuity takes off and becomes airborne. We can prove that we can fly. There can be a manned flight in Mars, in a Martian surface. We can fly things in the Martian surface. All of these things motivate a man's journey to Mars, right? So inevitably so, and I think it's just a logistical planning thing, we'll get there. We may get there by the end of this decade. We may get there by the early stages of the following decade, but we'll definitely get there soon.
And you think that's the gap between getting there and populating it shouldn't be that big, right? What's your thought on that?
Well, the human being is phenomenally adventurous. If we go back to the late 1400s, and you would pack dozens of men into a caravel or a ship, and wives would say goodbye to their husbands, and sons would say goodbye to their mothers, as they would embark on this trip towards the unknown, because they were certain that the world would end at the very horizon that they would see, let's just say from Lisbon. That was no different than what we're seeing now to Mars. That was also a one-way trip. From the hundreds of men that would man these caravels, only 20-30% of them would come back. Most of them would never come back, rather. And nevertheless, we did it. We did it in the name of whatever. Arguably at the time, Christianity, globalization, mercantilism, economic development, whatever it was, but we did it. So if there's a way, civilization will find its course. And at the end of the day, we will be a spacefaring civilization. Carl Sagan, famous words, the civilizations that last are the ones that become spacefaring. I don't want to be as fatalistic as that sounds. I don't think that, Mars will be our plan B because our plan A is gone or because we don't have any, a plan A. I think that we can have both, right? And I think that we'll have financial incentives, we'll have social incentives to colonize Mars. There will certainly be, Elon Musk said it, and I think that, and I agree with him, and I think that all the other guys that are leading these programs will definitely agree, and some of the governments that are already leading these programs will agree as well, that there's tremendous financial opportunity and scientific opportunity in Mars and other space assets, whether that's asteroid mining or any other sort of asset. There's an incredible opportunity out there, and I think that man will find it. Civilization will permeate through and will find a way to establish themselves, whether that's in Mars or any other planet. In this case, in our solar system, we know that all other planets seem to be inhospitable. Mars seemed to be the one that we could terraform, that we could somehow habitate.
Being out there means also having access to this whole new universe of minerals, gold, nickel, platinum, and things that, we don't even know about, but might drive us to an exponential jump in new technologies by having access to those, new materials, right? Or even discovering organisms new to the planet that could, I don't want to sound dramatic, but that could really, let's say that they could keep us in trouble, right? What to expect from these advancements in space mining? Because now we were talking about us going and being out there, but for sure it's happening just as bringing there to us and bringing things to planet Earth, right? What's your thought on that?
Well, if you talk about it from a sheer scientific point of view, yes, we'll find stuff that we know of. We find stuff that we probably don't know of, or that we don't know of in its expression of existence. Perhaps we'll know certain elements and certain compounds, but we have yet to see that manifestation. And those are all true possibilities. And if you think about life, we only know the life that we know, right? So we know complex organisms that define our biosphere, life here on Earth. We know what generates life. We know the molecules that trigger life. We know that we need to have carbon compound. We need to have HO2, H2O compounds. We know life as it is today, but we don't know other forms of life that are perhaps manifestations chemically, other compounds that generate anaerobic life as we don't know it, as we have yet to know it, as we have yet to discover it. So yes, that's a possibility. So from a scientific standpoint, that information is incredibly valuable because we will utilize certainly that information as we become a spacefaring civilization to get to know our solar system and understand the potential associated with other forms of life. So they can only strengthen our own manifestation of life, biologically as it is. in terms of materials, there are certain materials or certain compounds that will be exposed to, that will learn about, that could potentially become materials that will assist us in lowering our carbon footprint, for example. Perhaps we'll find alternative sources of energy generation. Perhaps we'll find solutions or mediums that may assist us in developing solutions to our own problems here on Earth. So those are the true benefits, and that's how we need to embrace this opportunity. The obvious, today, with regards to some of these materials, pertaining specifically to mining, it's the extractivist mentality that we as humans continue to have had. I mean, it was exactly the same motivation that put those folks on caravels to sail across the world, find India for spices or find the Americas for gold. It's a very same extractivist mentality. That's what we'll take up to Mars, and that's going to be pertinent and present in whomever is going to mine those asteroids. They'll think about, wealth, and they'll think about forms of generation of wealth. But there are also other things. There are also industries that will specialize in developing tools, that will develop jobs. There's also externalities associated with bringing that sort of wealth to the planet. So think about it. If today we generate 80 somewhat trillions of dollars worldwide as a global economy, what about if tomorrow we could generate the double, right? If we could double our global economy with much lesser impact because we're not extracting raw materials from Earth. Oh yeah, but you're extracting it from Mars. We're causing another problem on Mars. Yes, but is there some calibration that could take place? Is there the potential to perhaps compensate or to generate a certain rule or certain rules, whereas, you could find a true balance? I say yes. But for that, you need to have governance. You need to have rules. The rules must be written. If they're not written, we'll do up in Mars, eventually, we could do in Mars what we did back in the Age of Discovery, right? In the 1500s, in the 1600s, right? We'll do the same.
Do you think that for getting this governance and getting the rules updated, we're ending up getting... Do you think it's going to be more like a United Nations role to do that? Or are we having like a universal United Nations or something like that? Who do you think is going to take charge? Currently, we just have United Nations for that, right?
Well, I hope that this podcast will get to Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General. My message to him or to one of his associates, as they may listen to us, is that they ought to get involved. Just think about the United Nations was created in 1945, right after the Second World War. And it was created basically to prevent a third world war, simply put. That's my opinion. The United Nations did a great job at preventing a third world war from happening. I think that if we were to experience that would have happened before. So they've done a great job at doing that. And I think that sheer proof that they know themselves, that they've done a good job at preventing that from happening, was the fact that in 2017, they raised a new flag. They raised a new raison d'être, a new reason of being. They said, listen, we are now associated with the global, right, sustainable development goals. We want to generate opportunity. We want to manage our resources as a civilization, worldwide civilization. We want to raise awareness towards things such as energy, poverty, shelter, infrastructure. And I think that was great. So they developed 17 areas, each of them very, very important with regards to our environment, our planet, our well-being, availability of wealth, generation of prosperity, right? Social impact, technological impact, environmental impact, political impact. So they have already reinvented themselves, and they've done a great job, particularly through some of their agencies like Global Compact and such, to manage those programs worldwide. So I think that they've already demonstrated their capacity to innovate and disrupt from within. I think that the next disruption that they ought to take is to become the environment and manage the ecosystem where the governance of space conversation and development takes place. They ought to be that environment. They ought to be the environment where they bring the public and the private sector towards a neutral, agreeable area, ecosystem, where big decisions can be made. Because we're talking about tremendous amount of wealth. We're talking about tremendous interest, public and private. So you ought to have an ecosystem that's prepared to hold that type of conversation. And I think that today, a true expression of that would be the United Nations. Have they manifested interest? Do they have a view or that understanding whereas they could play their role? I'm not certain. I'm not sure. I think we're still at the very early stage. I think they should. I think they should start to raise that awareness. I think that also space could be one of the development goals, could be one of the areas that they should focus directly. And the first step would be to develop governance, to generate awareness towards governance. So I think so. If they don't do that, there'll be a tremendous vacuum. Someone else will do it. Someone else will fill that void.
Let's make sure they listen to the interview then. Peter, great conversations that we had today. Thank you so much for your time. And as I mentioned before, just, get back to us when you launch your book. We'll have to be talking about that as well in the future. And we're going to have our Brazilian partner getting in touch as well. It was such a pleasure to have you. Thank you, everybody, for listening. This was Peter Cabral for Future Hacker. Do you have any final words, Peter?
No, just a tremendous, immense gratitude to be here with you guys today. Just namaste. I thank you all, and I wish you all the best. Thank you. Appreciate it. Success for everyone. Let's build prosperity.
Future Hacker. Life. Path. Future.